For decades, the question of how Patrice Lulumba, the first prime minister of the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo, died, and the related questions of who killed him and why, were subject to much speculation.
The short answer is that Patrice Lulumba was executed by a firing squad on January 17, 1961. Together with two of his ministers, Joseph Fokito and Maurice Mpolo.
Just how he came to be in that position requires a longer discussion that takes into consideration the political climate in Congo and the state of international relations at the time. This short documentary narrates in detail the circumstances that led to his arrest, torture and eventually his execution.
Lumumba was inspired by the independence movement of Africa after attending the All-African People's Conference in Ghana in 1958. This spurred him on to organize nationalist rallies in his country, resulting in deadly protests that got him arrested and later released to negotiate Congo's independence.
He led the Democratic Republic of Congo to independence on June 30, 1960. After the country was passed on from King Leopold II, who took control of it as his private property in the 1880s, to Belgium in 1908 as a colony. Independence came with lots of problems, including a political divide and an unapologetic Belgium led by King Baudouin, who minced no words during the Independence Declaration.
Don't compromise the future with hasty reforms, and don't replace the structures that Belgium hands over to you until you are sure you can do better. Don't be afraid to come to us. We will remain by your side and give you advice. King Baudouin said.
Devait dire et remercier le roi. De l'autre côté de la tribune, quelqu'un fignole un discours non prévu au protocole. Il va dire ce qu'il ne faut pas dire.
Du roi Baudouin, qui nous rappelait comment la Belgique nous a sortis de l'esclavage, comment ils ont lutté pour nous sortir des maladies du sommeil et patati patata. Ça a été un choc. Nous ne nous attendions pas à ce rappel malheureux parce que nous estimions que le roi Baudouin n'avait plus de leçons à nous faire ce jour-là.
An outraged Lumumba rather gave a dramatic and angry speech in reply to King Baudouin. This left the king startled and frowning and caught the world's attention. Lumumba spoke forcefully of the violence and humiliations of colonialism, from the ruthless theft of African land to the way that French-speaking colonists talked to Africans as adults do to their children. Political independence was not enough, he said. Africans had to also benefit from the great wealth in their soil.
À ce moment-là, Lumumba se lève, qui n'était pas programmé comme devant parler à ce moment-là. Il se lève et il parle. Il fait un discours très militant.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir au matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres.
Rappelez-vous comment on traitait le blanc par rapport au noir. Rappelez-vous dans les écoles quelle place nous occupions. Rappelez-vous tout l'apartheid. Alors évidemment, réaction immédiate de toute la délégation belge. D'abord, beaucoup d'agitation pendant que Lumumba parle.
Qui oubliera enfin les fusillades où périt tant de nos frères, ceux qui ne voulaient plus se soumettre au régime d'injustice, d'oppression et d'exploitation.
This heightened Belgium's disinterest in Patrice Lulumba, whose government was already being opposed by his political rival and president, Joseph Kasavubu.
C'était mal reçu par les Belges, mais nous avons tout à fait répondu à nos aspirations.
Et au moment du dîner, on demande à Lumumba de présenter des excuses. Il ne s'en fait pas. Il présente les excuses en disant « Je pensais que je devais dire à cet homme des choses, je les ai dites, donc si ça a blessé, je m'en excuse et je demande qu'on tourne la page et que nous puissions voir les choses autrement. » Mais il était trop tard. La majesté était lésée. et la Majesté les a décidés le soir même de se venger et tout a commencé.
Only 3 months into the new and independent Congo, soldiers mutinied against Belgian commanders who refused to leave. And some regions, including the mineral-rich Katanga and South Kasai, rebelled against the central government and seceded with the backing of Belgian troops who were sent to protect their interests.
For the Belgian army and General Janssens, who commands it, had the impudence to say that independence means nothing.
The Congolese government called for the United Nations help and a resolution was passed by the Security Council calling on Belgium to withdraw its troops. United Nations peacekeepers were sent into the Congo to restore order and use force as the last resort to secure country's territories.
However, Belgium did not leave and the UN failed to provide the Congolese government with military assistance as demanded by Patrice Lulumba and sanctioned by the Security Council. The United Nations also ignored the Prime Minister's appeal to send troops to Katanga but rather chose to negotiate with secession leader Moise Deschambault. The United States was a strong ally of Belgium and had a stake in Congo's uranium.
There are only 2 countries in the world that supplied cobalt at that time, Soviet Union and the Congo. And cobalt is extremely important for jet engines and all sorts of high technology. And we could not get it from the Soviet Union because it was a security commodity. So Congo was our only source.
It is suspected to have planned an assassination as disclosed by CIA agent Larry Devlin, head of CIA station, Congo.
I received a message saying that people in Washington were highly concerned about the activities of the Prime Minister and that they hoped that he would go, there would be a change in the government. The next thing I knew, I received a cable saying that someone by the name of Joe would arrive in Leopoldville, and I was to take my instructions from him. And the instructions were that I was to remove him physically from, in other words, assassinate Lumumba. I asked first, whose instructions are these? And he said, they've come from President Eisenhower.
By September, the Congolese President Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba as Prime Minister after receiving a telegram from Belgian Prime Minister Gaston Eyskens. Lumumba also declared Kasavubu deposed. This ushered in the takeover by Army Chief Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko, who placed Lumumba under house arrest and guarded by his troops and the United Nations troops.
Lumumba had just promoted his personal secretary, Joseph Mobutu, to Army Chief of Staff. Mobutu was to coordinate with the UN troops to stop the country's descent into anarchy. Instead, he turned to Larry Devlin.
Mobutu said that the army was very unhappy with the Prime Minister because he was turning the army over to the Soviets. He wanted to mount a coup d'etat, but there was one condition. They had to know that they would have the support of the United States government. I had tried and failed to achieve by legal means what they wanted, the United States government wanted. So I stood up, shook his hand. Finally, it took me a while to do this, and said, I guarantee you the support of the United States government. And the coup d'etat, he said the coup will take place within a week, and it did.
Patrice Lumumba slipped away on his own accord on November 27, after a United Nations vote to seat President Kasavubu's delegation rather than his own. Fearing that he would lose the protection of the United Nations force, Lumumba headed for his own stronghold of Stanleyville, 1,000 miles to the east.
He escaped with his wife and baby son hidden in the back of a car, leaving his residence. They headed towards the east where he had loyal followers in Kisangani, then Stanleyville. He engaged villagers on his way. They had to traverse the Sankuru River, after which friendly territory began. Patrice Lumumba and several companions crossed the river in a dugout canoe to commandeer a ferry to go back and fetch the rest of the group, including his wife and son.
But by the time they returned to the other bank, government troops pursuing them had arrived. According to one survivor, Lumumba's famous eloquence almost persuaded the soldiers to let them go. Events like this are often burnished in retrospect, but however the encounter happened, Lumumba seems to have risked his life to try to rescue the others, leading to his arrest.
Allez, on y va.
Je ne peux pas. Je retourne.
Ne fais pas ça. Je te l'interdis, c'est de la folie. Tu dois aller à Stanleyville, c'est ton devoir de militant.
J'ai laissé se venger sur ma femme et sur ma fille. On dit après que j'ai laissé faire ça.
C'est du suicide, Patrice.
Je vais leur parler, ils sont pas nombreux. Ils m'écouteront.
C'est la folie.
Mokonzi, tolingi kosala mabe te, kasi esengeli olanda biso. Soki te, bakoboma biso.
Si vous m'amenez, c'est moi qu'on tuera. Mais sachez qu'on vous le pardonnera pas et que vous aurez à le regretter. C'est moi qui vous ai donné le commandement de la force publique alors que tout était aux mains des Européens. Si ce sol buvait mon sang, ce sera votre propre destruction.
Il a raison.
Moi je suis lumumbiste, je reste avec lui. Tikabozoba bokanga mino konabino. Limisa Mokonzi. Batindi biso ndemos.
He was captured and another plea to the United Nations to save him fell on deaf ears. He was flown to Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, where he was humiliated in public in the presence of journalists, United Nations officials and his wife, Pauline.
Ce qui m'a frappé, c'est qu'il était armé. J'ai dit, oh là là, il n'en sortira pas. On amène Lumumba à la villa du colonel Mobutu. Mobutu regarde les soldats mal.
Colonel Mobutu ordered his detention at a military prison at Iceville, 100 miles from Leopoldville. For 6 weeks, Lumumba was kept in cells, and that's where he wrote letters to the United Nations for help and to his wife to calm her nerves. On January 13, 1961, the Iceville garrison mutinied, demanding higher pay and threatening to put Lumumba back in power.
Devlin, the CIA operative, sent an alarming cable to Washington. Station and embassy believe present government may fall within few days. Result would almost certainly be chaos and return of Lumumba to power. He added, refusal to take drastic steps at this time will lead to defeat of US policy in Congo.
The next day, Lawrence Devlin, the CIA agent, was informed that Mobutu was going to transfer Lumumba to a prison in a safer place. 3 days later, Lumumba and his 2 former ministers were flown to the province of Katanga, the stronghold of his arch-enemy Moise Tshombe, on January 17 while being beaten so badly that the pilot warned the violence was threatening the flight. As he stumbled off the plane in the provincial capital of Elizabethville, blindfolded, his hands bound behind his back, he was kicked and beaten by Katangan soldiers, thrown into a jeep and driven off into custody by Katangi's police and military under the supervision of Belgian forces. They were driven to a colonial villa owned by a wealthy Belgian, Villa Bruet, and the beatings continued by both the Congolese and Belgian forces. By that evening, they were semi-conscious and had been visited by Katangi's cabinet ministers and President Tshombe himself. Later around 10 p.m., a decision was taken on their fate and they were dragged from Villa Bruet into a nearby bush where a firing squad awaited them. The execution was commanded by Belgian Captain Julian Gat and Belgian Police Commissioner Frans Verscher, who had overall command.
They were shot separately by a big tree as President Tshombe and 2 of his cabinet ministers looked on. Being the last to be shot, Patrice Lulumba watched on as his ministers were being executed. The bodies were quickly thrown into shallow graves.
Ne comprendraient pas. Tu leur diras simplement que j'étais arrivé 50 ans trop tôt. Tu leur diras que ce que nous voulions pour notre pays, d'autres ne l'ont jamais voulu. Ma chère Pauline, lorsque ces mots te parviendront, je ne serai plus en vie. Tu diras à mes enfants que l'avenir du Congo est beau et qu'il attend d'eux la reconstruction de notre dignité. Tu leur diras que tout au long de notre lutte, jamais je n'ai douté un seul instant du triomphe de la cause pour laquelle mes compagnons et moi avons donné notre vie.
Va les chercher. Monsieur Lumumba.
To conceal their crimes the next morning of January 18th, the Interior Minister Godfried Munongo called a senior Belgian policeman, Gerard Seat, to his office and ordered that the bodies disappeared. You destroy them, you make them disappear. How you do it, it doesn't interest me. All I want is that it happens that they disappear. Once it is done nobody will talk about it. Finished. Gerald Seat recalled Munongo's orders.
Gerald Seat said he and another helper exhumed the corpses and hacked them in pieces and put them into the acid. But we hadn't got enough, so we burned what we could in those bottles. For the rest, I know that my helper made a fire and put them in, and we destroyed everything. We were there 2 days. We did things an animal wouldn't do. And that's why we were drunk, stone drunk. We couldn't do things like that. Cut your own, no, no, no. Nobody could say now, today, it's there, it happened. That's impossible, you couldn't. Gerald Seat was quoted in a BBC documentary, Who Killed Lumumba?
Just as planned, Lumumba's death was announced a month later on February 13, 1961. Interior Minister Munongo announced that the 3 prisoners killed their guards and escaped in a getaway car before they were recognized by villagers, who beat them to death. The world went ballistic, including anti-imperialist leaders such as Ernesto Che Guevara of Cuba and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana.
Bajo la bandera de las Naciones Unidas en el Congo fue asesinado Lumumba. Y esas eran las Naciones Unidas que pretendían los norteamericanos que vinieran a inspeccionar nuestro territorio. Esas mismas Naciones Unidas.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I appear before you today on a sad and solemn occasion, the first meeting of the General Assembly since the murder of the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lulumba. History records many occasions when rulers of states have been done to death. The assassination of Patrice Lulumba, however, is unique in that this is the first time in history that the ruler of a country has been killed in the very presence of the United Nations forces, whom he himself had invited to his country to restore law and order.
Lumumba's assassination resonated throughout the world.
The truth was hidden despite international protests at Belgian embassies nationwide. In 1999, Ludo de Vita's book titled, The Assassination of Lumumba, presented new evidence taken from documents long hidden in official archives and interviews of surviving witnesses.
The Belgian court ordered the return of the tooth of the DRC's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lulumba, to his family in the DRC. The tooth is the only remaining body part of Patrice Lulumba. The decision to return his remains has been well received by many Congolese in the DRC. Mr. Lumumba's daughter has described it as a great victory for the dignity of black people. The Congolese independence hero was assassinated in 1961 by rebels from Katanga province. His body is reported to have been dismembered and dissolved in acid. A Belgian soldier is thought to have pulled his tooth from his corpse and taken it to Belgium. Patrice Lulumba became the DRC's Prime Minister in 1960 at the age of 34. He was a strong advocate for an end to colonial rule. The court's decision will end years of lobbying by activists and his family members for the return of his remains. Chris Sochamringa, SABC News, Kinshasa.